In Korea, the Cold War is heating up. The Communist North's invasion of the South challenges the newly formed UN, forcing its leaders to draw lines in the sand. As the fear of another world war looms overhead, an American spy slips through the dark, gathering intelligence for an impossible mission. In battle, the outcome is often decided before the first weapon is fired. This is the story of the covert operation that helped take an army by surprise. The counterstrike that exploded the Korean War. These are the events that shape our world. These are the leaders that risk it all. These are the final moments before war. This is Edge of War.
The element of surprise plays a vital role in war. Used properly, it can give a general a strong advantage over his enemy. The first battles of the Korean War involved strategic and tactical surprises, maneuvers both sides used in an effort to establish effective control of the battlefield. But in my opinion, surprise in war can only get you so far. Critical mistakes like underestimating the resolve of your enemy or allowing your plans to fall into their hands can turn a surefire victory into a resounding defeat. This makes war part science, part art, part design, part luck, and the victor will be the side best able to handle the complexities of it all.
An uneasy peace is shattered by a surprise dawn attack. North Korea unleashes the full force of its communist army on the unsuspecting South. Using air power and heavy shelling, the Korean People's Army pushes across the 38th parallel in a massive coordinated advance. Outnumbered and outclassed in troops and firepower, South Koreans are virtually defenseless against the invasion. 3 days into the attack, the Communist Army closes in on one of its prime targets, the South Korean capital of Seoul. Hundreds of innocent civilians, men, women, and children, fall prey. It's a day South Korean Eddie Ko will never forget.
I was 14 years old, and I heard the rumbling sounds and bombing sound, and all these noises are coming from the north side of Seoul. And everywhere I looked, there was killing going on. I stopped at this hospital, and I saw about 50 of South Korean POW armies. And they pulled the stretcher out on the front yard and killing every one of them. I went to my house to tell my mother we better separate our family. I was very upset and angry, and I was going to retaliate.
It doesn't take long for the city of Seoul to fall entirely into North Korean hands. A strategic and symbolic victory for North Korea, a demoralizing loss for the South. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman sees the invasion as a direct threat to American interests.
The view in Washington was that the Korean advance was the first of a number of possible Soviet moves in the Far East, and that Korea was as good a place as any to draw a line in the sand.
President Truman requests the United Nations set up its very first international army. The 16-member countries agree to allow the U.S. to take the lead. Truman puts General Douglas MacArthur in charge and gives him a single goal: stop the North Koreans.
General Douglas MacArthur is the Supreme Commander of American forces in the Pacific. He's supremely confident in his own abilities. He's the military governor of Japan. He is the symbol of America in the Far East.
MacArthur's abilities and confidence are about to be tested. He's now the man in charge of stopping the communists. On June 29th, MacArthur visits the battlefield to assess the situation and witness the devastation firsthand. It's clear he needs troops on the ground and fast. But moving divisions into place takes time. So MacArthur orders a small unit of American soldiers to fly in from Japan. Named Task Force Smith, their mission is to slow down the powerful North Korean army, giving the general a chance to organize. 9 days after the North Korean offensive begins, Task Force Smith sets up 25 miles south of Seoul, near the city of Osan. 400 young American soldiers dig in, gripped with anticipation. For most, this is their first experience in a war zone. Fresh out of basic training, combat is a certain fate.
We were lined up on a hill facing the road coming south. The North Koreans came down this road with T-34 tanks. We fired on these tanks from a far distance, as far as we could, but we're not able to stop these tanks. They came right through our positions and went on south.
Following the tanks, thousands of KPA soldiers enveloped the Americans, attacking from 3 sides.
This caused the Task Force Smith to disintegrate.
Outnumbered 10-1, the task force suffers devastating losses. 1/2 of the 400 men are killed or wounded. A similar fate awaits American soldiers stationed further south, near Daejeon.
American forces were overrun again. One of my very good friends was killed in that first engagement. He only had a few minutes of combat, but he was a very good man, a very fine man, and he was killed in the first days of the war.
Unable to slow down the North Koreans' push south, the entire UN army is forced back to the Pusan perimeter. As they retreat, the UN forces destroy every bridge crossing the Naktong River, looking to buy time to regroup.
We were caught in a situation then when there was a lot of fear that we could not hold the Pusan perimeter. That was when the greatest period of fear was. We were holding the Naktong River line, which was the last defensive line that we could hold before Pusan. And General Walker said that we are going to hold this line. We are not going to retreat.
Pusan was the major port in Korea. We could not have supplied troops without keeping that port. The war was over if they captured Pusan. Walton Walker knew it and exhorted his troops to fight or die.
General Walton Walker's 8th Army digs in and desperately fights week after punishing week to stay their ground. Their goal? Buy enough time for MacArthur to generate a new plan. The commander's hopes of stopping the North Koreans higher up the peninsula were dashed. So now he needs to formulate a different strategy, one for the history books. But keeping it a secret will be a battle in its own right. It requires shadowy figures, dangerous espionage, and a gamble so risky, MacArthur is perhaps the only man brave enough to make the order. And given the complex history in the region, at stake is the start of another world war.
The communist North Korean attack on South Korea shatters a 5-year period of fragile peace. But tensions between North and South have been simmering for years. This was the beginning of the Cold War, a period when small regional conflicts became settings for the world's superpowers to square off against one another without engaging in world war. So in order to understand the origins of the Korean War and understand America's involvement, you have to go back to the end of World War II, when lines were drawn that set the stage for conflict.
World War II ends with the unleashing of 2 American nuclear bombs on Japan. Japan signs an unconditional surrender on the USS Missouri, giving up its colonial territories in Southeast Asia. Korea, free from decades of Japanese rule, is then forced to accept a new kind of occupation, at least temporarily.
Truman and Stalin agreed to divide the Korean Peninsula in half at the 38th parallel. In the north, there would be a Soviet military government. In the south, an American military government, until such time as they could agree about the future of Korea.
General Douglas MacArthur, the highly decorated and larger-than-life hero from both world wars, leads the American military presence in Asia. MacArthur has crafted a reputation as a brilliant and stubborn military tactician.
One of my favorite lines about MacArthur is from Dwight Eisenhower, who served as his chief of staff throughout much of the 1930s. And he had always said that he studied theatrics under MacArthur, who had a very large ego and was very aware of public relations.
To lead South Korea through the transition process, the U.S. government throws their support behind a man with close ties to the West, a right-wing leader named Syngman Rhee.
Syngman Rhee is an interesting figure in the history of South Korea. He is a political activist. He was exiled by the Japanese. He lived in exile for 30 years, spoke fluent English and Korean, had a doctorate from Princeton. When the United States was looking for someone to help head a provisional government in the South, Syngman Rhee was their man.
Together, we can build a stronger Korea, a better Korea, a Korea that we can be proud of.
However, once in power, Rhee shows his true colors, ruling over his own people ruthlessly.
The Americans never trusted Syngman Rhee once they had him in Korea. They discovered that he wasn't interested in democratic institutions. We were sorry we had him there, but we had nobody else to replace him.
Rhee wants to reunify Korea on his own terms, by force if necessary. Afraid that Rhee's saber-rattling could start another world war, the U.S. provides training for his forces, but deliberately keeps him weak.
They were to train an entire army of South Koreans, most of whom were illiterate, had no background in the military, and had poor equipment.
In North Korea, the Soviet Union installs their own preferred candidate, communist hardliner Kim Il-sung.
Kim Il-sung was selected by the Soviet Union to head the provisional government in the north. And once in power, assisted by Soviet authorities, he selected people who, like him, had been trained and operated in the Red Army during the war.
The ambitious Kim Il-sung quickly builds a powerful army, in contrast to the undersupplied army to the south.
Many of them were well trained because they had fought in China under Mao Zedong and came back with uniforms and equipment.
Like Syngman Rhee, Kim Il-sung wants control of the whole peninsula.
They were both dedicated to unifying Korea and putting the other regime out of business, either by subversion or international sanction or by war or whatever it took.
For citizens, a national dream is being torn in two different directions.
After 30 years of occupation by the Japanese, I think the general response was anything's better than Japanese occupation. But I believe their hope was for a united, independent Korea, free of foreign rule. The way they wanted to go about that differed markedly in the north and the south, but that mutual goal of an independent Korea was very much at the heart of what the Koreans wanted.
For communist leader Kim Il-sung, There's one clear solution: war. A war he thinks he can win, especially if he gets support from the Soviet Union and China. In early 1949, he travels to meet with both Stalin and Mao Zedong.
Kim is not in any shape to unify Korea on his own by force. He needs permission in effect from Joseph Stalin, and more importantly, he needs modern supplies, guarantees of some aid from the Soviet Union, including tanks, modern equipment, logistic support.
Stalin sympathizes with Kim Il-sung, but turns him down. Stalin knows the United States has the atomic bomb, and that the firebrand North Korean leader could trigger another world war. The rejection is a blow to Kim, who returns home empty-handed. A few months later, there's a dramatic change in the equation. Despite the communist threat, American military leaders, including General MacArthur, want to reduce their role in Korea. MacArthur tells a British journalist that the American defensive perimeter in Asia will not include Korea. In January 1950, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson announces publicly that Korea no longer falls within the U.S.-Asian defense perimeter, echoing MacArthur's earlier comments. The communists view this decision as an invitation to invade. Believing the U.S. won't get involved, Kim Il-sung thinks he can take the whole Korean peninsula in just 3 weeks. He initiates a surprise attack to catch everyone off guard. Within hours of the invasion, South Korean leader Syngman Rhee makes a frantic call to General MacArthur, feeling America has left him exposed to attack. American air power and troops rush into the war zone, but fail to stop the North's massive communist army. Within 2 months, the UN force is completely cornered in Pusan at the bottom of the peninsula. General MacArthur's mission is to somehow find a way to push the communists back, to wage war on the peninsula, but avoid a larger conflict with the Soviet Union and China. Back in the U.S., anti-communist propaganda is rattling the American public. The message is clear. If Korea falls, communism will sweep across Asia and then the world. MacArthur believes attacking the enemy head-on could be devastating to American troops. It would also be exactly what the North Koreans expect. Instead, the general dreams up a bolder, more ingenious plan.
When MacArthur looked at the situation in Korea, he saw it differently than the North Koreans did. The North Koreans looked at the land. MacArthur realized that South Korea is a peninsula and is surrounded on 3 sides by water. We possess the greatest navy on earth, and we could land anywhere we wanted to. What we needed to do was to find a way that we could break the supply line of the North Korean army. An army needs 3 things in order to survive. It needs food, it needs ammunition, and it needs fuel. If you can cut off those elements, you can destroy an army.
The perfect target is the port of Incheon. If MacArthur can get a foothold there, he can recapture the capital city of Seoul and slice the North Korean army in half. Everyone else finds the plan too risky. The high tides and narrow channels surrounding the port of Incheon make it very hard to get on shore. Plus, the port is protected by an imposing island, Wolmi-do.
In order to take Incheon and to command the approaches, you first had to take Wolmi-do. Wolmi-do is an island connected to Incheon by a narrow causeway, and it had a high peak that dominated both the waterways leading up to the harbor, but also the proposed landing beaches.
Move our forces into the port of Incheon.
August 23, 1950. MacArthur takes his case to the skeptical Joint Chiefs of Staff.
MacArthur hears out all of the objections about why Incheon is a bad idea, and then he spoke for about 40 minutes very eloquently and passionately about why Incheon was the right place to land. At the end of the speech, everybody agreed with him.
The plan is dubbed Operation Chromite.
War is unpredictable, especially when you're dealing with a leader who's prepared to take risks, as MacArthur was. To reduce those risks, generals have learned to rely on covert operations, led by specially trained teams or even a single spy. These units become their eyes and ears on the ground. They learn more about the lay of the land and in some cases find out about hidden dangers that can change the course of a mission. As victory or defeat hangs in the balance, a general's decisions are only as good as the information he's provided.
August 1950, 2 months after Kim Il-sung's communist forces begin to devour the Korean peninsula, General Douglas MacArthur devises a bold and risky plan to stop the surge and regain control. The goal of Operation Chromite is to launch a counterattack and cut the North Korean army off from their supply lines. Selecting the port of Incheon, MacArthur needs to learn the lay of the land before he can invade. The nature of the tides, landing areas, the size and movement of enemy forces. Getting this vital intelligence requires a dangerous mission. To pull it off, MacArthur's staff in Tokyo tracks down a highly skilled operative, Lieutenant Eugene Clark.
MacArthur wants to invade Incheon. I need you to go in there, deep cover, and I need you to give me some information. You're going to have to get a team of operatives together, and you're going to have to keep your head down. Keep yourself in one piece, Gene. Sir, that's an order.
September 1st, 1950. Lieutenant Clark slips into enemy-controlled territory. Unnoticed by the North Koreans, he lands at the island of Yeonghong.
All the islands near Incheon was many islands that they were occupied by the North Koreans or the sympathizers of the North Koreans or secret army, secret policemen all over. It was a very dangerous area to be.
Clark and his operatives are armed with automatic handguns, grease guns, and 2 heavy-caliber machine guns. Once behind enemy lines, Clark begins building a small team of local sympathizers to assist in intelligence gathering.
Clark recruited a group of teenage Korean boys to find out the number of troops that were there, what kind of weapons were there. They would arouse no suspicion because they were just children.
One of those boys is 14-year-old Eddie Ko, a boy who escaped Seoul 2 months earlier. Clark sends Ko to study the area around Wolmi-do, the key island defending the waterways into Incheon, an island General MacArthur has to neutralize.
빨리 하라고 너, 늦게 하지 말고. 좀 해봐도 돼요?
에이, 네가 아직 하기는 이르지. 그리고 저거 하려면 한 일주일은 더 걸려.
I got to know the guard, and I asked him, said, what's going on back there? And he said, well, we have about 500 soldiers here staying permanently. So I give those information to Mr. Clark right away.
Clark's recruits eventually make it to Incheon, infiltrating enemy positions and gathering critical information about the strength of North Korea's defenses. They also keep their eyes open for any troop movement that shows the enemy has uncovered the mission or MacArthur's ultimate plans. For many of the young operatives, Clark's secret mission becomes a harsh introduction to the brutality and tragedy of warfare. One of Eddie Ko's friends, also spying for the Americans, learns the North Koreans might be onto him. Trying to track him down, KPA soldiers target his parents.
His parents were in the town square ready to be executed. But he said, I can't watch my parents get killed because of me. So he went up, and then they dragged him. They just killed him. They actually killed him with bayonet in front of him. He's watching his parents get bayonet.
Alongside his parents, Eddie Ko's friend is also killed at the point of a bayonet.
They showed everybody, you help the Americans, that's what's going to happen. I told Mr. Clark, And he saw me so upset. He said, what are you going to do about it? I like to revenge them. I like to go kill those guys.
Eugene Clark outfits the young operatives with rifles, teaching them how to shoot.
I went to town to looking for those North Koreans who killed my friend's parents and him. And I found out from one of the restaurant owners, and they are in a geisha house and having a party there. We just went in there and just killed all of them.
While his operatives provide valuable information and support, Lieutenant Clark leads the most dangerous parts of the mission himself. Under the cover of darkness, Clark sneaks up into the channel and into the Incheon waterways to measure the tides. Any miscalculations, and General MacArthur's plan to land behind enemy lines will fail.
The channel was narrow, and also the mud flats at Incheon were very deep, and we would have a very difficult time landing, except at certain times when the LSTs could float in tides high enough for them to land.
Exposed on the open water, Clark is forced to wait for what seems like an eternity for the tides to go out. Silently, he slips into the chilly water to verify the exact depth of the low tide and the nature of the mud flats. For an American landing to have any chance of succeeding, his timings have to be precise.
They had to land on the actual ground in order to discharge these Marines who were on the LSTs. There was only a 3-day period where the tides were high enough in the Incheon harbor to permit these LSTs to come in and float into the shore.
At the end of each day, Clark transmits his findings to Tokyo via shortwave radio. At the same time, the battle plans for the Incheon landing are finalized and delivered to the Army commanders by General MacArthur. With Clark's data in hand, the ground landing is set for September 15th. Operation Chromite calls for the involvement of more than 250 ships carrying 70,000 soldiers. The combined forces include men and munitions from 13 different countries.
These forces had to be assembled. We took them out of civilian life. We took them from various places around Europe and other places. We brought all the troops that we could find, and we assembled this large group of forces.
Unaware of the UN's plan to strike, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung senses a communist victory, and a unified Korea is within reach. For MacArthur to catch him off guard, Operation Chromite must remain secret. An almost impossible task for the spy and his team working behind enemy lines.
We often say there are two kinds of plans in the military. Plans that won't work, plans that might work. You have to avoid plans with a fatal flaw. You have to take a plan that might work and make it work. Sometimes the riskiest plans have their own advantage, that they're the last thing the enemy expects. But if a covert operation goes wrong, it can reveal your secret intentions, remove the element of surprise, and do more damage than any good. Because when there are spies, there are counter spies. If they get wind of your plans, they can turn enemy defenses into enemy fortresses.
September 1950. General Douglas MacArthur wants to catch Kim Il-sung's Communist Army off guard with a surprise attack behind enemy lines. To pull it off, he's putting a plan into place to strike the port of Incheon. For the plan to work, he has a 3-day window when the tide patterns will allow American ships to land. Even if the timing is perfect, MacArthur will not be able to get soldiers on land unless he first wipes out North Korean defenses on the protective island of Wolmi.
Woolmedo is a critical first objective because if fully manned and fully armed, it becomes the key to the harbor's defenses, and anybody firing along the waterfront could easily disrupt any kind of amphibious landing.
It was equipped with what we call case-mated 75mm guns, which were very accurate guns. We had to destroy the 75mm case-mated guns before we invaded Incheon.
Working for 6 days behind enemy lines, Lieutenant Eugene Clark scouts the defenses at Woolmedo, relaying more and more information on the tides and landing sites to his superiors. But the area is thick with communist spies and sympathizers. On September 7th, Clark spots a pair of sampan sailboats heading straight towards him, carrying KPA soldiers. Manning his boat-mounted machine gun, Lieutenant Clark opens fire, destroying one of the North Korean gunboats, sinking it to the bottom of the channel. Then he turns and fires on the second boat, forcing the other North Koreans to retreat or die. Clark's actions reveal his presence to the enemy, and he knows they'll soon be back with more men and more firepower. On September 11th, to confuse the North Koreans about where they might land, American ships carry out drills near Kunsan, far to the south. 2 days later, with the communists distracted, 6 American destroyers quietly slip up north, laying anchor 800 yards off Woolmedo.
We pulled up a line of American destroyers within very easy range of these guns. We knew they were there, but we did not know where they were because they were camouflaged. We pulled there and we let the destroyers just stand there and wait. The North Korean commander had a decision to make. Was he going to allow this to stay and not do anything about it, or was he going to fire on these destroyers? If he just fired on the destroyers, then he would give his position away. If he didn't fire on the destroyers, then maybe he was violating his duty.
8 tense minutes pass before the communist commander finally fires on the exposed ships.
When he did fire, then we started a process of locating precisely by azimuth and other technical means precisely where these guns were. These guys were sitting there taking potential killing blows because they knew they had to do that in order to make the invasion succeed. So the great heroism that I see that was exhibited at Incheon was exhibited by these destroyer guys. That was what was done so wonderfully fast and so very extremely well. So it wasn't a space of more than a minute that they were able to locate precisely where these guns were. They shot cannons right straight down the tubes of the 75s and destroyed every one of those 75s.
With the heavy arms on Woolmedo neutralized, more than 200 American ships follow the lead of the destroyers and quickly close in. In the wee hours of September 15th, Lieutenant Eugene Clark has one more task to perform in his dangerous mission. As North Korean soldiers continue to hunt his team down, Clark heads to the lighthouse on the tiny island of Palmy to help guide the invasion fleet in. Remaining undetected, Clark and his team arrive at the lighthouse after midnight, but struggle to bring the signal back to life. Clark's mission is complete. It's the first time in the annals of war history that a lighthouse in enemy-held territory has been used to guide a hostile invasion. "6 a.m. the UN task force once again unleashes payloads on positions at Wolmi-Do, followed by airstrikes to soften up Incheon itself. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the UN troops and Master Architect of Operation Chromite, watches from the deck of the U.S. ship Mount McKinley. MacArthur still fears that communist spies may have leaked word of the surprise attack. As the landfall approaches, it is a life-or-death situation for every American soldier involved.
The troops were obviously very nervous and concerned about what is there at the end of the track or the boat that they were on. What are they about to face?
6:30 a.m. The lead unit of the Marines 10 Corps have just 2 hours to land on Wolmi-Do before the tide recedes. The North Koreans fight back, but they're no match for the UN troops. Wolmi-Do is captured in 88 minutes, with no UN casualties and only a handful of injuries. The North Korean gun positions and garrisons on the island are neutralized. With the first wave of landings complete, the ships retreat with the tide to the outer harbor. The soldiers left behind must wait 11 long hours for the tide to return.
The Marines on Wolmi-Do sat and waited intently over their weapons, expecting a counterattack to emerge, watching some movement at Incheon. The expectation was, after signaling their intent to invade, surely the North Koreans would start to bring some forces back north.
If the Communist Army can reinforce Incheon before the Americans get to the mainland, MacArthur's surprise attack will backfire, ending in a crushing defeat.
When lives are on the line, leadership is critical. Trying to land at Incheon is a very high-stakes risk. It's no surprise many of his contemporaries thought it was doomed to fail. If MacArthur has a fault, though, you can say it's overconfidence. And that often meant he was standing alone at the top. For soldiers heading into battle, you have to have trust in the leader above you. Under MacArthur, soldiers did just that. They were ready to do what needed to be done when the bullets began to fly.
September 15th, 1950. As Phase 1 of General MacArthur's risky plan to land behind enemy lines, Marines managed to capture the protective island of Wolmi. But until more UN troops can join them, the best they can do is hold their position. Their biggest fear, a full-scale retaliation from North Korean forces rushing into the area. By early evening, the tide brings a second wave of Marines. But until they get off the beach, they remain easy targets. Using ladders, Marines make the dangerous climb up and over the seawall, directly into the teeth of North Korean defenses. For 6 hours, they punish the North Koreans. This time, it is the communists that are outnumbered and outmatched.
The Marines did a brilliant job at Incheon. They lost very few men. They caused enormously successful damage to the enemy. So that way, it was an incredibly fast and incredibly efficient operation.
The real concern was on the evening of September 15th, the North Koreans would be able to launch an armored counterattack upon the landing force before it was fully organized and in position around Incheon. Fortunately, that didn't happen. The North Koreans were already about 24, 48 hours behind.
One day after the daring dawn raid on Wolmi-Do, the entire port of Incheon is firmly in Allied hands. A new defendable beachhead for MacArthur on the peninsula. 90% of the North Korean army is over 100 miles away, leaving too much distance and not enough time to respond.
It gives you a sense of the weight of the bombardment, the swiftness of the attack, the sophistication of the amphibious landing, that it totally overwhelmed the defenders. By the time that MacArthur's armada, his sledgehammer, landed at Incheon, the North Koreans were so overdrawn that it was almost a fatal blow. MacArthur's gamble worked.
As he steps on land, just as he had in the Philippines 5 years earlier, General MacArthur makes sure there are photographers at the ready. Images of the victorious general are transmitted around the world, sending a clear message to the communists. The Korean peninsula will not be given up without a fight. With Incheon firmly in their control, the UN troops begin their march towards Seoul. For communist leader Kim Il-sung, it's a drastic reversal of fortune. What looked like certain victory now looks like imminent defeat. The surprise American invasion threatens to trap his communist troops still deep in the south.
Once we landed at Incheon, we were able then to cut the railroad line that supplied this army, and we could do that without having lost a single soldier. There were very few losses at Incheon, and because of that, it was one of the most successful operations in military history.
By September 25th, Seoul is recaptured. With their supply lines now threatened, more than 30,000 communist troops flee north from the Pusan area, heading back to North Korea to regroup and giving up their grip on the southern half of the peninsula. In spite of MacArthur's tactical success at Incheon, the bitter and brutal fighting continues for another 3 years. Korea becomes a global showdown between communist superpowers in the east and the United States on behalf of democracy in the West. A struggle that cost millions of lives.
From a global perspective, Korea was the first hot war of the Cold War. And it took place in a region of the world that no one expected the war to break out. Everybody believed that if there was to be a third world war, it would start in Europe. What the Korean War did was touched off a huge investment in rearmament across the world and really deepened the tensions of the Cold War.
When he started the war, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung thought he could finish it in a matter of weeks, underestimating the American response and allowing General MacArthur's own surprise amphibious attack to rout his army. Still at that point, nobody imagined the conflict would go on for another 3 years. Brilliant strategy on the battlefield can only take you so far if the other side has unlimited resources and allies unwilling to give up. Korea became a proxy war between the superpowers. Instead of total war between communism and the West, it set a pattern of so-called limited war. By that I mean a war in which the superpowers refrained from using all the weapons in their arsenals, and in which the conventional notions of victory were transformed into something akin to hard-fought, bloody stalemate. In 1950, each side thought they would take the entire peninsula. Little did they know, after millions of casualties, the war would end right where it started, along the 38th parallel, with a communist North backed by the Soviet Union and China, and a democratic South allied with the West. A Korea that has remained divided to this day.